So welcome to Ask Me Anything About Workspaces. Originally, there were some people asking about what is Workspaces, how is this related to me, and so on. So we decided to open this up for questions. Hopefully you read the prerequisites of what we want to accomplish in Workspace, but in a very TLDR way. Workspace is the top level namespace that is supposed to be somewhat like the instance level for self-managed users, but on SaaS, but at some point it'll all be the same, called Workspace. The way that we started this project was actually bottom up and not top to bottom. So even though our ultimate goal is to reach the Workspace level, which is the top level namespace, we started by creating a project level namespace, which was the common foundation level namespace on which we're going to build the Workspace. So that was a very, very short intro, and we'll jump into the questions. So it looks like the first question is from Victor, which isn't on the call. So I think we'll skip to 2 to see if he's going to join, because there's some clarification questions for him. So do we have Austin? Austin is not on the call either, but I'm gonna read his question out loud. So Austin said, I'm working on mapping out features and settings that would be looking to leverage Workspaces for group compliance. How could I ensure a seamless transition? This is a great question, and it's not only, oh, hey, Austin, I was just reading your question out loud. So it's a great question because it isn't very only specific to compliance. This is actually relevant to any group that wants to migrate features over to this new concept. So Austin, if you want to verbalize your example, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I had some trouble finding the passcode for the meeting, but I put that in the agenda as well. Yeah, so as I'm considering the number of features that my group is responsible for, and I'm sure other designers are asking themselves the same question, I'm trying to better understand how I can ensure like a smooth transition for the features that are spread across the different areas. A good example for compliance is we have a different version of the audit events feature in the admin area for groups and for projects. Mostly it's due to like back-end constraints of performance queries. So when we're talking about creating like a single space and within a namespace or within a workspace, trying to understand how I can help paint that vision for what it's going to become.
So great. I answered very generically, but if Gosha wants to jump into the technical evaluation, I'll let her do that as well. So the short version is like this. The whole point of the project that we're working on now is to consolidate groups and projects. So that would mean that there would be the same namespace for projects and groups, but it would change, the behavior would change based on the hierarchy of where they're located. So subgroups, groups, and so on. This is unrelated to the admin panel. And so theoretically, if you haven't started implementing a feature, I would recommend doing it first in this new namespace concept so that it would work for both project and groups. When we're migrating existing features, we need to migrate it to this new namespace, and then theoretically, we only have to have it implemented once. One of the goals of Workspace, besides creating this top-level namespace, is really getting rid of a bunch of redundant code. A lot of us have the same feature implemented for project and then for group and maybe in instance, and maybe we even have it in some other places. So for example, for plan, the label picker, which is our official name for this feature, which is where you select labels to add to issues, it's implemented in 6 different locations. And so this simplifies it and lets you implement it once. Okay, so that's an added bonus that we have from this implementation and why it's worthwhile for us to do it in GitLab internally. Regarding the admin panel, that's a little bit different because that functionality is available for different users and it has a whole different UX component. And so I think that you can start with moving the functionality to groups and projects once we finish phase 3 of allowing migrating new features. But the admin panel will probably have to wait until the admin panel actually moves to the workspace, to the top level namespace. Gosha, do you want to add to that?
Yes, one thing that admin panel will stay for self-managed instances. So this will, of course, simplify between groups and projects, but for self-managed, the admin panel will stay as it is right now.
Cool, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't think my audit events feature is the perfect example. Part of the reason why the admin area has the feature to begin with is because it has full scope over the entire instance. And it just is non-performant within SaaS as it is today. So I think what we hear often in the compliance world is we want to see feature parity between the different levels and from like the admin area being exposed into SaaS. I think my hope is that we'll be able to leverage Workspaces to help create that. So consolidation, like you said, or with like labels, doing something similar for the different features and settings that we have. So I'm trying to even kind of like earmark several of the issues that we've kind of put off for a while and officially say like, hey, we're not going to create feature parity for this setting within groups because this phase plan should take care of that. Is that fair to assume?
Yeah, I think so. With again, with excluding the admin area, the project and groups should be fairly simple.
Okay.
Harris, you're up.
Okay, so I was just wondering how, what is the future for groups and projects, and how should we think about these? Because when I think about me joining GitLab, this was the most confusing area of all, which is the navigation menu around groups and projects, like knowing what group I'm in and what project I'm in and what's the difference and why is there a difference was confusing. So first of all, thanks to everyone who's doing this for clarifying this for our users. This will be very important to remove some of the confusion. Like a lot of the SaaS scores that I've been reading through the individual responses talks about how confusing the navigation is, understanding what things are. And I think comes from the fact that we belong to a group and a project, and these two things are different, and you can do one in one and one in the other. So this is great. So I was wondering what the future is. Are we going to be merging these two into one concept, and how should we think about that new concept?
Yeah, so you're not alone in your confusion, Harris, as you know, from the SUS scores, and I think all of us have probably experienced it. So the short answer is yes, that's one of the overarching goals. And I think when we think of the Workspaces group, there are several kind of goals that I would say, and one of them, the overarching one, right, is simplifying the data model for GitLab so that it's easier for customers to understand concepts and to have more parity between self-managed and SaaS. We have created this concept of groups and projects, and there's sort of, to the user, right, it feels like artificial differences between them. So that's one of the things that we want to do away with, and essentially have one container of resources and features that can be stacked into a hierarchy, right? And that's the future. It's going to take a lot of work to get there, right? Both from the engineering and UX side to basically transition from where we are to there. But right now the team is working on laying down the foundations for that. And essentially there was a lot of discussion, and I can find the architectural blueprint and link it here in case y'all are interested of like what the best way was to approach this shift. And what was decided from the engineering perspective is that basically we're going to have a namespace for behind the scenes, right, in the database for groups, projects, and personal namespaces. So all of them behind the scenes will have this anchor of a namespace. And the team's working now on creating a namespace for every one of those three objects that exist today, and like having a way to do that migration. And then two, of migrating key features, like for example, users and authorization, to instead of relying on a project or group or personal namespace, rely on a namespace. And then basically that's what the feature will be, right? Where features won't be built against group, project, or personal namespace, they'll be built against the namespace, and that should make it available at all 3 levels. That's like a very simple statement, but there'll be a lot of considerations and work to go into that. And there's 2 features that are targeted as, I'll call them the guinea pigs. The label picker, like Reed said, and issues. And we're basically going to explore what those 2 is, like, what does that mean, right? To tie a feature to a namespace. And the hope is that we'll go through that process, document what that was, and have that be a starting point for other groups that basically want to transition. And it will require work from teams to basically change their implementation to tie to a namespace instead of a group or a project.
Cool. I was hoping that we would just get rid of both separate concepts and just go with something. So that's great. So my second question is kind of more of a concrete. So what does it mean to me? Type question, which is now, and I think this may be interesting for other groups as well, but sort of looking from the import perspective, where we do have group exports, group imports, project exports, project imports, where we rely on taking that data, serializing and deserializing somewhere else, and then recreating that particular concept. I would imagine at some point the underlying data will change. At some point, maybe even the API calls would change. And I'm curious, like the data and the API, when can we expect those to be different or different enough? Or will they ever be? I mean, or will there be magic behind the scenes that makes it so that I'm able to export a group and export a project and import a group and import a project, and it goes from a namespace to a namespace, and import is no wiser there. So question, the first up question is, do we get to the point to where these become different and we actually need to do work to make import continue to work? Because we also need to worry about transition. Well, what if I'm doing it from an old GitLab that has a project into a new GitLab that has namespace? So there's a lot of work there. And if that's the case, what is the very high level, like your best guess at the timeline? Because we need to schedule resources and work to be done for that to happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it's all, I don't have a concrete answer, but I think for you specifically, right, if I think of the use case of import that you just laid out, you would need to wait until all of the components that you would be touching basically are tied to a namespace in order for it to be so like to the point where you can migrate either to a group or a project for one or the other. So I think for you, you would need to wait. And I think there will be a point. We haven't discussed what the timeline for this is. I would say it's probably more than a year out. Right, there will be a point where we would retire the concepts of groups and projects, and it would just be a container, right? I don't know, we haven't defined a name, but namespace is basically what it is behind the scenes. So there would be that point, but that's way in the future, right? There's a lot of work to do before we get there.
I actually think there is some things that import would probably need to do before others. So right now we're in the process of backfilling existing projects to project namespace. So I think that the importer, once they import new projects, they would probably need to take that into consideration and already import into project namespace. I'm not sure it's ready yet, Dosha. So you tell me when we should expect that.
I believe that there are issues on that, so I will tag you, Harris. But I think that team was like prepared to manage it by them. Workspace team was ready to manage it, as we are like updating the, for example, service that creates projects, like the new projects. But I will tag you in the right issues, Harris.
Great, and then please keep in mind that like if there are changes that we will have to do something about, just tagging as early as possible, and also tag Liam, the EM, for the import team, so that we're kind of all on the same page there.
Of course, but the first implementation that's going on right now is rather like everything is happening in the same time. So we are not touching the current implementation, we're just like adding a little bit. So then we can like make a change in a way that's invisible for users and it's not creating any problems.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So let me see that I have, so I did have a sub question, and that is, so as other groups maybe decide to move things from project or group into a namespace, let's say issues or labels or some of those concepts move into that, does that continue to be transparent to the importer? So if the importer is asking for a project, will we get those labels still? Or do we need to now change the importer to look for it in a different spot, which is now the namespace? And
For
just
now, it
also,
will continue to work for the meantime.
okay.
And if that changes, we would communicate more broadly. Basically, if we say to groups like, don't pull anything using a project anymore, use a namespace, that would be like a broader communication, but that hasn't been planned out yet.
Okay, and finally, I do want to insert a statement, which I don't have in here, and that is just sort of how we work, and this is general for GitLab too, and that is, if you're implementing any feature that changes other things, you are kind of responsible for adding it to other things as well. So, if on an issue we implement something like, I don't know, something that we currently don't have, some kind of a date or some, like a co-owner or some other attribute, and that is added to the data schema, that team is responsible for adding it to the export and the import and the logs and the database and adding it to all the different aspects that we do have. So I just want to kind of state that so that everyone is aware that import team, is not going to be able to just play a catch up. So like, now we implement something new that breaks the imports, and now the import team needs to, like, in an emergency fashion, add that to the importer. Is not how we work. So I'm not saying this is happening now, but I have seen projects where things were just added to either a project or a group or any kind of a data structure, and people will typically forget also to add it to the, like, a project export, and then also the project import. So all of a sudden, like, that thing is not working, and sometimes they even make it a required field, so that when we try to create the project with that field missing, now all the project imports start failing. So there's definitely an expectation that things will continue to work and imports and export will continue to work. And we can provide help, or we can actually do some of this work, but this would need to be scheduled way ahead. Hannah?
I was wondering if Workspace is a user-facing term or something we're just using internally. And also, I think, Marcel, you kind of summed up what I'm really getting at here is, how is this going to change the UI? Like, are we going to hear our customers saying, I just spun up a new workspace of GitLab, or is it going to replace the term instance? These are all kind of questions I'm going through my mind.
So yes, Workspaces Customer-Facing, we already created some documentation around it, which I think is in the agenda. In my mind, it should replace the instance at some point, but it's going to take us a while till we get there. So the idea is that a workspace is your landing page for your organization, and this is what you're going to see. So obviously, the most, like, besides moving features to this top level namespace or the top parent group, you can think about it like that. The two really big features here are the admin ability and settings that can be cascaded and inherited. Those are the two big ones that will be a big change for SaaS users. But at some point, we would get rid of the differences between instance and workspace at some point. Again, it's going to take us like over a year, but there are very small nuances that would change, like hardware settings, which SaaS users don't need, and we need to keep that in self-managed and so on. But the idea is that it would replace instance at some point.
For .com, would there be multiple workspaces?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. So it's more than just the instance, right? Like if for SaaS, it's multiple.
Multi-tenant.
workspaces.
It should be,
Yeah.
At the moment, we're looking at it simplistically. So like every organization has a workspace, but some may want more we haven't gotten that far in terms of how we're going to solve that problem, but right now we're thinking about organization with a single workspace.
I put a link there, and a lot of other tools have a similar concept. Azure was the first one that came to mind. I'll find additional ones, but I put a link to how Azure sort of what their model looks like. They have an organization, is what they call it, and then within there they have like teams and projects, and it's all within their big SaaS instance, and it works the same way for for self-managed. That's more similar to where we would end up as a concept, not the details.
So Marcel had a question here that I'm still a bit fuzzy on, where he asked how the creation of group project will be impacted. And we say that it's behind the scenes. What do we mean by it being behind the scenes?
So we also have Nick on the call. So just Nick, keep me honest. The user shouldn't feel any difference whether or not they're creating a group or project right now, if it's a namespace or if it should be the regular flow. We're not changing anything dramatic right now. So it should stay the same. The dramatic change will be once we get to that workspace top level namespace where we're like, what are we going to show? What are users going to see? How can you drill down from one place to another? But for now, the consolidation of projects and groups should be exactly the same user experience as it was before.
Totally. And to add to that, we're approaching this iteratively as well. So we're going to maintain and keep projects and groups for a while we're transferring to this namespace construct. But eventually we want to merge, but we haven't got around to that yet. So in the meantime, projects and groups are going to stay the same until we get to the point where we're ready to actually transition properly and merge everything together. And then we need to have a lot more detailed plan of how that's going to work out. But in the short to medium term, not much is going to change, I imagine.
Do we have any lowest fidelity, even just a flow of how that would work, artifacts that can show how the entire user flow would be? Because I'm still extremely confused about what the difference between a top level group for a user would be compared to a workspace and how they would understand this. Because right now, even just a top level group, to me, seems to be the similar concept for a user to what a workspace will be. And I don't still understand where the user will feel a significant difference except in added features for this and why we need to call it something different then.
Sure, I'll drop in a couple of links as to the exploration around that new workspace construct and container. My focus has been on some other stuff at the moment, but yeah, eventually I'll get around to fleshing that out in a little bit more fidelity for you as well. But I'll drop some links in.
Wonderful, thank you.
So my next question was whether a workspace uses the underlying, what we're calling a namespace now with additional settings, or if they're separate items, and it sounds like this is TBD.
Yes, essentially we had started to talk about this, but decided to pursue merging groups and projects first, tying things to a namespace, and then seeing basically after that was implemented what made sense for the top level, like the workspace essentially. So Austin, you have the next question.
Yeah, thanks. So similar to how Marcel was saying, it's confusing to him how it changes the difference between like a top level group and like a workspace. I'm wondering, how do we prevent the same problem that we've created essentially with groups and projects today, where groups essentially become a container for projects and workspaces then become a container for namespaces? How do we avoid this hole that we got ourselves into initially, I don't really know all the origins of how a group started. All I know is like initially GitLab just had projects and then groups were added. So perhaps like Daniel was maybe alluding to, maybe there is something on the back end that, or like the way that we are structuring these objects that prevents this from happening again. But I just wonder if we run into the same like feature parity discussions between workspaces and namespaces in the future.
Yeah, this is what my previous question, why I was asking the previous question as well, for the same reason.
So I think my response, I
sorry.
don't know if I clarify or not, but this is, I think, is a big confusion across everyone trying to learn about workspaces. Workspaces is just a name for the top level group object. Namespace is the logical object in the code. Every object, group, project, instance, namespace, or excuse me, instance, group, project is a namespace object.
So my follow-up question, why do we make it a user-facing term then? Why isn't the top level group enough?
Because we're going to have a workspace switcher, hopefully in the future, and top level group switcher does sound nice, maybe.
And also we have got a solution validation issue, which I've posted further up in this agenda, where we will be testing these names out as well with users, just to make sure, because workspace, namespace, they're placeholders that we're working with in the meantime, but we want to test all this stuff out with users, make sure it's understandable.
I don't know if namespace is being tested, because like I said, it's not a thing that it's exposed to the users. It's a code object.
Yeah, it's in the code, correct, but our users also have access to our code. So a big thing here is making sure that it's sort of throughout the entire stack makes sense with regards to naming and terminology.
Follow-up question to the workspace switcher. If it behaves exactly like the top level group we've had so far, and if it's the same structure and information architecture, why do we now need a workspace switcher when we didn't need it so far for the top level group?
So one difference, Marcel, that I think will be, just as an example, right, different from a top level group today to something like a workspace, is that there'll be more functionality in it. Like, for example, users, right? Like your collection of users will live at the workspace level, as an example, right? So you'll have different sets of users, groups, and projects settings all within a workspace. And configuration like LDAP and SAML. I'm saying access features because those are the ones that I've thought about the most. But those will all live tied to a workspace. So it will be almost like switching instances, right? Like going to a different GitLab URL and accessing it. It's that level of change versus a different top level group, if that makes sense.
But don't we already have users in our top level groups? Aren't there also members, and don't we also have settings in our top level groups?
Yes.
But not in
So
this
So
setting.
it won't be a migration in my mind, right? And this is all TBD. It won't be like top level groups are sort of promoted automatically to be workspaces. I think it'll have to be more explicit than that. But that is, again, TBD. I think there will be a migration possibly with user actions required to have a workspace in the future.
Yeah, and I also want to remind that cascading the settings is the big deal here. That doesn't automatically happen today. And also the ability to have that admin view. How many seats do I use? How do I unblock a user? Today, our customers actually have to go through customer support, which is a drag. So it's a big deal to get to this top level namespace workspace concept.
So if we need all of this in the top level, in the workspace, won't we also get to a point where we are going to need this again in the sub-level group? Aren't we having the same problem then again, that we have a different interface, a different UI between workspaces and groups? And won't we get to the point where you might also need building information, or like exactly what you mentioned about the workspaces in the groups?
So that goes to Austin's question. And I think that's a great consideration. That's something that we've discussed internally at length, that basically we don't want to get into the situation again of groups and projects, but now it's workspaces and namespaces, right? So that was part of why we decided to defer the decision of like, what does the implementation look like of a difference between namespaces and workspaces, right? Are they the same thing with just like we turn some things off intentionally, right? We don't know yet. We basically decided to tackle the hairy problem of merging groups and projects first, because we knew that was something that we did need to do regardless. And basically see where we ended up after that, and if it was possible to reuse the same implementation of container, so that we don't have basically two versions of a very similar thing again. But TBD. But your concern is definitely something that we've discussed internally at length. So we're at least worried about it, and we'll try not to replicate that same problem.
Cool. Thanks for the information.
Great, we're a little bit over, so we'll stop here. I want to thank everyone for joining, and if we want to do another Ask Me Anything, we can do it in a month or so. So thank you again. I'll post the recording.